Welcome back to the Equity Institute's podcast on the purpose of public education with me, your host, Vincent Perez. Today, we'll be speaking with Dr. Tracy Castro-Gill. Tracy is an award-winning middle school educator and PhD who focused their dissertation on the retention of educators of color. They are the co-founder and executive director of Washington Ethnic Studies Now, which advocates for ethnic studies and anti-racist education in K-12. Tracy's background is in social sciences, leadership, and racial equity, and developing a K-12 interdisciplinary ethnic studies program. It was a delight and always appreciate the connection I have with Dr. Castro-Gill. Please welcome Dr. Tracy Castro-Gill. Thank you so much for taking time with us, Dr. Tracy Castro-Gill. Congratulations on your PhD.
Thank you.
For our audience, could you please share a little bit about who you are and what is your connection to public education?
Okay, so currently I serve as the executive director of Washington Ethnic Studies Now. We're a small but growing nonprofit in Washington State, and we focus on advocating for anti-racist and ethnic studies education in K-12 schools. We do a lot, mostly professional development. We're also writing some curriculum and, of course, political advocacy. Prior to that, I was the first ethnic studies program manager for Seattle Public Schools, and I worked with a group led by Rita Green and the NAACP King County. I was going to say Youth Council, but they didn't exist yet. They formed after that. But the NAACP in King County to push ethnic studies into Seattle Public Schools. And so Seattle Public Schools was really the first school district to approve an ethnic studies program and start working on an ethnic studies program. And I helped lead that effort initially. Prior to that, I was a middle school teacher. I've taught in Seattle Public Schools and in Federal Way, and I love middle school students. And if I were ever to return to the classroom, I would only teach middle school. A lot of people say they feel intimidated by middle schoolers, but I feel like they're just that perfect age. They're babies. They're still interested in learning, but they're old enough where you can mess around with them, like joke with them, and they get it. So, and they appreciate it. And they don't just get it, they appreciate it. So I just love middle schoolers. I also teach part-time at the University of Washington. I've taught in the teacher prep program. I teach in the American Ethnic Studies program. Yeah. That's what I do. That's my connection to education.
Thanks for that frame. I also really appreciate the note on middle school students. It is a wondrous time. There's so much happening there.
Yeah.
I appreciate you acknowledge that time of development for us as human beings.
Yeah.
So with that perspective, right, middle school, ethnic studies, working in a large school district, one of the largest in the nation, what do you see as the purpose of public education?
Well, I think that my belief around the purpose of public education has been developed in spite of my work in education, because I don't think we're doing what I consider to be the purpose of education, which is teaching us how to be humans, teaching us how to love and appreciate one another, teaching us how to love and appreciate our Mother Earth, teaching us how to reflect on who we are as individuals within a larger community. I should say larger communities, right? Because we're part of multiple communities through our lived experiences. And I see what education doing now. I used to say churning out worker bees. I don't know if I would change that. I think it's pretty much still the same thing. This whole focus on college and career readiness, that's important. Kids need to know how they're going to financially sustain themselves and possibly a family in the future. But that shouldn't be all that there is to life. But that's what we're teaching students, that is the most, if not only, important thing to consider through the process of education. And we learn it from home for the most part, but we learn in our home context. That doesn't prepare us to go out and be human beings and have relationships and interactions with people who don't share our cultural backgrounds or who don't share our family's beliefs and traditions, right? And so it just becomes a very insular process where we further remove people from their humanity. The purpose of education right now really is to strip you of your humanity. That's not what I would consider the purpose of education.
Yeah, I really appreciate how this conversation has been interpreted, right? So it's what is it doing, but what is its actual purpose? There is a theme of a humanizing experience to be a stable person with others, especially, as you mentioned, not in sync with our communities, right? That they may be in other communities but still part of this larger, really, society, whether it's city or state or even a church or synagogue or a mosque, right? So all of the aspects where we share our connections. So I'm curious, especially from an ethnic studies perspective and all your work there, I think really leading the conversation in the state is, what have you seen really work? I mean, there are philosophies, approaches, frameworks that you've seen being implemented in policy or practice. What's really working?
I would say I haven't seen anything come from official policy that's working. I think what is working comes from grassroots efforts. There's one example I can give you at a district level that I feel like is working, and that's Shoreline School District with Dr. Tanisha Brandon-Felder out there. She's like her title just changed, but she's like the director of their equity programs. She's been working on, she calls it the Ethnic Studies Fellowship. And she recruits about 30 educators every year. And I think she's going into her 4th year. And they just have really intensive professional development. So I work with them. They go through my professional development, which is focused almost 100% on pedagogy and shifting paradigms. And then she brings in content experts to talk about, Black studies and AAPI studies and things like that. And so they get both of that. And then the fellowship, I think, is the most important part, because they're not just left to their own devices after that. They become part of this bigger fellowship within the district. And so they've completed 3 years. So that's nearly 100 educators in a district the size of Shoreline, which is pretty decent. And I appreciate that strategy so much, because I'm a firm believer in collective capacity. We don't necessarily need mandates. We don't necessarily need policy, because to make that shift between the dehumanizing work of education that's happening right now and the rehumanizing work that ethnic studies advocates for really requires a shift in the hearts and minds of the people who are teaching. And so I think Tanisha is working towards that collective capacity better than any other model or example I've seen in any other school district. So I mentioned that I was starting the ethnic studies program in Seattle Public Schools, and it started as a grassroots movement. And then once the school board approved a resolution in support of ethnic studies, then it became like a policy program initiative. And that's where it lost steam, because we see this happen a lot in movements too, right? Like there's a movement to get something done, a law is passed, and then the movement dissipates. And the reverse should be happening. The movement needs to stay in motion to make sure that the thing actually happens, right? And after I left Seattle Public Schools, which was a very controversial move, a very contested move, the system, Seattle Public Schools, effectively disbanded the movement, because people were so angry and upset that their work had been taken away, right? Because I was placed in that position not just because of my own merit, but because the community was behind me and really advocated for me to take that position. And so when I was pushed out, the community was just disheartened, and the movement pretty much ended there. And so now Seattle Public Schools is doing a lot of box checking, right? Like, oh, we have this course, we're letting anybody teach it, regardless of whether or not they have experience or expertise in teaching ethnic studies. And so we work within this contradiction where policies and laws and things like that are necessary sometimes, but oftentimes when you pass a policy or create a law, it shuts down the actual work.
That's kind of fascinating as we think about the bureaucracies and all that exists, right, to wade through. I'm curious, though, with this Shoreline model and really this cohort, right, this fellowship concept, I think as an educator, you can't teach what you don't know. Mm-hmm. And you can't teach in a particular way that you've never experienced yourself, right? So I am a firm believer in that. So I'm curious, especially with your experience in Seattle, what are the challenges to getting to a model like that, to a cohort model? And then how would you overcome them?
Well, specific to ethnic studies, I think a lot of people, I know I know a lot of people have a misunderstanding of what ethnic studies is. And a lot of people, when they hear ethnic studies, their first thought is content, right? Especially at the secondary levels, so like 6 through 12. So over the past, I've been doing this for 7 years now, specific to ethnic studies. Over the past 7 years, what I've seen is people at the secondary level, especially high school, focus on what we've come to call trauma porn, where they hear ethnic studies and then all they teach about is oppression, right? Lynchings and land theft and genocide and like all those things that we know happen, but it's because that's all they know. Like you said, they don't know the joy, they don't know the beauty because they've never been taught that either. And so people first go to content and then go to the trauma porn. What we teach at Washington Ethnic Studies now is that you shouldn't even consider teaching ethnic studies unless you have transformed your pedagogy. And when we say pedagogy, we're talking about how you think about yourself as the educator in the classroom, how you think about your students, how you think about your community that you teach in, how you think about just all the way down to like even how you set up your classroom, right? If you set up your classroom with straight desks in a row, don't teach ethnic studies. Like that's the first most immediate red flag, right? If you stand at the front of the room all the time and you're doing 90% or more of the talking, don't teach ethnic studies. And so that's kind of the biggest barrier, is especially people who have positional power, are decision makers, and those who have the ability to decide where funding goes, they don't understand ethnic studies. I would say in my experience, teachers are far more advanced in their understanding than administrators. Mm. And so fortunately with Tanisha, I worked closely with her husband, Dante Felder. He was part of the original group in Seattle Public Schools who wrote the ethnic studies frameworks. And so, you know, she has that relationship with Dante to kind of see what he was doing with us. And so she had a better grounding and understanding of what we were doing with ethnic studies. So that was helpful. But a lot of district administrators, they don't want to know. They don't care to know. To them, it's just something that they have to manage, not understand, right? And that's the antithesis of ethnic studies in a systems model. Is you have to not only do you have to understand ethnic studies, you have to understand yourself and your role in it.
You know, I went to a Chito, the Chicana Institute for Teaching and Organizing, in the summer of 2014, down in Arizona, and it changed my life. Mm-hmm. And it changed. I mean, when you speak about the reflection of self first, right, and you know, that's self-location, that critical reflexivity in understanding your place in the world in relation to students and families and the bigger system. And there was something very beautiful about that. And Kim and I have we're in 8 years now going on bringing Chito just for a 3-day institute here in Washington State. But you make me think about something that Dr. Norma Gonzalez says in elementary school. So what is ethnic studies at the elementary? And she talks about self-love. Mm-hmm. She talks about the projects of mixing paint to match your skin tone and writing about it and exploring that and the beauty and the poetry in this art project. So I'm curious your reflection on that, thinking about this kind of shift of pedagogy in a humanizing way. What are educators experience when they begin to take on an ethnic studies approach?
That's my dissertation. And we learned, Washington Ethnic Studies now has learned a lot from Chito. All of our board directors have been to Chito. Actually, our organization started when Dr. Curtis Acosta came out and did like an assembly with a bunch of educators on the west side of the state who were doing ethnic studies. And that's how Washington Ethnic Studies now was born. We kind of call Curtis our godfather. My dissertation, I interviewed 17 educators of color. And the questions I asked them were like, you know, what racism do you experience in your profession? How do you feel valued in your profession? And what role does ethnic studies play in that? And all of the participants said ethnic studies is one of the only reasons why they're still in education. Wow. Which is significant because the average educator, regardless of racial identity, typically stays in the profession for 5 years. Educators of color, it's 3. All of the educators except for one, all 16 educators, were in the profession between 5 years and 30 years. One was a brand new teacher. She was going into her second year teaching. One teacher literally said, it saved my life. Ethnic studies saved my life. Everybody talked about how ethnic studies created a sense of freedom for themselves. So we're not even talking about the students. Like a lot of the scholarship that's out there on ethnic studies is about the impact it has on students. So that's why I wanted to focus on educators. And one educator, Chicana educator, was like, I feel so free. Like I can be myself. I don't have to fit into this mold. And not only can I be myself, like I'm modeling that for my students, right? So my students have that same freedom. Several educators, specifically Black educators, and this model, this aligns with the research that I did before doing my interviews, is that Black educators enter the teaching profession to change it, right? To change it. That's the reason why they enter it, and to be advocates for Black students. And the Black educators I interviewed all pretty much agreed with that, right? And one educator, she had been in it for like 20, 30 years, and she said, I should retire. Like I'm at retirement age, but I still have work to do. Ethnic studies gives me a purpose. So it's not just a profession. It's not just a job. It's a purpose to support the upcoming generations. And so I think it's really, I'm glad you asked that question because, the research I did, because we're doing a great job at recruiting educators of color. We're doing a horrible job at retaining them because we don't transform the systems that are pushing them out. And Dr. Gloria Ledson-Billings, this was like 30 years ago in 1998, was talking about how we have to transform the curriculum if we want to keep educators of color, but nobody's really looked at that in the scholarship. And so I was trying to fill that gap with my dissertation. I found that ethnic studies can be a tool to help retain educators of color because it's rehumanizing for the educators that are teaching it and not just for the students. And I didn't focus on white educators because we don't have a problem retaining the white educators, but I'm almost positive if I were to do the same thing with white educators, it would be a similar response, right? Because at least in our model that we advocate for, like you said, it's a lot of reflecting on self. And I feel like white educators have to do more of that to teach ethnic studies, because I honestly and firmly believe that white people in the United States have lost touch with their humanity more than anybody else, because they wouldn't, like their ancestors wouldn't have been able to commit genocide, to create Indian boarding schools, to institutionalize slavery on the level that they did if they had connections with their humanity, right? And so I feel like white people have succumbed to cultural genocide in the United States. And so I think that requires them to do far more soul searching and reflecting on who they are. And so I think if a white educator engages in that authentically, it's going to be just as profound for them as it is for an educator of color.
I could see then a cohort for European American or white educators to engage in this learning. And I like the term European American because it's the story in there, right, of an immigrant experience to this land base.
And a lot of white people, though, don't know. They don't know what part of Europe they come from, right? So I collect data of our membership, and I ask race and ethnicity, right? And so white people will say I'm white, but then for ethnicity, they'll either leave it blank or put unknown about 60% of the time. And it's the reverse for people of color. About 60% of the time, people of color will name their ethnic identity along with their racial identity. So we as people of color are generally more connected to our ethnic and racial backgrounds, where white people have been completely disconnected.
I actually think that's kind of a mechanism in racism, which creates this kind of whiteness and white supremacy culture, clearly based on pigmentation.
Right.
And erases, there is an erasure of our own histories, right?
Right.
And even for me I self-identify as a Chicano, but there's a concept by Cynthia Rodriguez, it's a de-indigenized indigenous. I'm closer to my indigeneity, but I couldn't give you a tribe. So I am curious that, when I went to Chito, there was some drum song and some opening ceremony in this piece, but the leader of that had shared that, this animal skin drum is from all of our ancestors, all across the globe, no matter what continent. And that was really kind of something foundational about that of course, right? Throughout history, all peoples have an indigenous roots, and some of colonization is separated some further from that, but there is some things in our DNA, in our cells, that is very communal in this way, and so it's really interesting to me if there were a ethnic studies for European American white teachers specifically for those cohorts. and what would happen then in education.
Yeah. I mean, most of the people who go through our professional development are white, because that's just the demographic of teachers in Washington State. We're above the national average for white educators. So, and yeah, like the feedback that we get on our evaluations is pretty high, and that's mostly coming from white educators. So,
and as we were speaking, the other side of that and retaining educators of color, there's a lot of movements, a lot of energy around recruiting educators of color for representation. Now, just over half of students in Washington State are students of color. Mm-hmm. So they're seeking it. Districts, everybody kind of up and down the system is seeking educators of color. And it seems to be a balance here. I'm really curious then about ethnic studies now, like your 5-year, 10-year plan. I'm curious about what you all have going on for us in the state.
Yeah, so we actually have that. It's called our Liberation Strategy. It's on our website. But one of like I said, our core work is professional development, because the collective capacity is probably our number one driver. Like, we need people in classrooms who understand this, because we're also getting examples of right-wing groups pretending to offer professional development for ethnic studies, but it's not ethnic studies. It's like this colorblind approach to teaching about, we're all different people, but we're all the same on the inside, and everybody's a human, like that kind of thing, right? So one of the most prolific organizations is called FAIR, Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism. I heard it was started by Christopher Rufo. I'm not sure about that, but he's the guy who started the whole anti-critical race theory stuff. But there's a lot of right-wing people on, like Megyn Kelly from Fox News is on their board. And they're going into schools in Washington State and saying that they're offering ethnic studies professional development. So the first thing is to make sure that people who are making decisions know that that's not ethnic studies. That is not what folks of color have been asking for and demanding for since 1968, right? So that's our biggest goal. Another goal is to create curriculum, because like you said, there aren't examples of what this could look like. Like the closest I come is the documentary about the folks from Sheepville, Precious Knowledge. Even though it's documenting their fight with Tom Horn, who's now superintendent in Arizona again, they do show like what was happening in the classroom. So we get a glimpse of what's happening, like what it actually looks like in these liberatory spaces. Part of our goal to provide examples is to just write curriculum that includes like, this is how you can decolonize this specific aspect of learning embedded within the lesson unit plans. So we got a grant from College Spark to do that. And so we're getting ready to publish 12 units next month, grades K-12, different content areas. I think we're doing 2 in math even. And then our next goal for us, hopefully soon, is to get a K-12 ethnic studies endorsement. We were working with PESB, the Professional Education Standards Board. They gave us a grant to do a pilot for a specialty endorsement. But with the leadership change, because Alexandra Manuel was the executive director of PESB, and she was pushed out for a reason that I don't understand, because I feel like PESB was going in a really great direction when she was leading it. And now Dr. Hernandez-Scott is leading it, and it's going backwards. And I don't know the dynamic that's causing that. But since Dr. Hernandez-Scott took over, PESB decided to not work with nonprofit organizations on specialty endorsement. So we did this whole pilot that they paid for. We collected all of these data, and now we're just stuck holding the ball, right? Because they reneged on their promise to let us go forward. And so now we're working on a policy brief, hopefully will be published in the next couple of weeks, calling not for a specialty endorsement, but a general endorsement for ethnic studies. And the rationale is for all the things that I've already talked about. Like, there are people out there teaching ethnic studies who are anti-ethnic studies. And we don't have to look any further than the OSPI framework on ethnic studies that was published. I authored a large portion of that ethnic studies framework. It was mostly myself, Dr. Vero Velez from Western Washington University, Brooke Brown, who was the Washington State Teacher of the Year a couple of years ago, and she's now down in Tacoma. The 3 of us authored, I would say, like 90% of that framework. And it started off, the whole process started off, it was a joke, right? Because like I said, the administrators don't understand what ethnic studies is. So they gave it to the social studies lead, Jerry Price, who's a straight white cis male, again, doesn't understand ethnic studies, recruited people who may or may not have had experience in ethnic studies. And I remember being at a meeting, one of these advisory committee meetings, and there was a Mexican man there who's a professor, and Rodrigo Renterias, and I can't remember the second part of his last name. But he was like going on and on and on about how ethnic studies is divisive. Like, ethnic studies is harmful and divisive. And I'm like, what are you even doing here then on this advisory group supposed to be writing an ethnic studies framework? And there was another woman, and when I said indigenous epistemology, she said, well, I'm a PhD and I don't even know what that means. Like, I don't think we should put that term in the framework. I was like, indigenous epistemologies is the foundation of ethnic studies. If that's not in the framework, we're not doing ethnic studies. But it eventually got taken out. The reference to indigenous epistemologies got taken out. And so even though the three of us wrote most of that framework, a lot of it was changed because they don't understand what ethnic studies is, to the point where Dr. Velez, like, protested. She's like, I'll never work for OSPI again because they're not about it, right? And I would say that's par for the course when you're talking about systems, when they try to do it from a top-down approach, grassroots.
Which is really interesting because it's one of the most empowering kind of endeavors I've ever experienced, right? There is something very life-giving about it. And even when you reference the documentary, Precious Knowledge, and thinking about historicizing not oppression and just like those points in history, but also resistance.
Mm-hmm.
Right? When did folks come together and for, interracially, cross-identity? I think of everything from freedom riders to the passing of the ADA. Mm-hmm. Like, the history of the passing of the ADA is fascinating to me. Black Panther, so many folks involved in that effort, right? That to me is...
Well, that really redefines our identities too. We talk about the erasure and cultural genocide and the loss of our identities. Like, I didn't know my tribes either until I went and did research. And now I can say I'm Nahuatl and Purepecha, right? I know that now. I didn't know that. I think I found out like 3 or 4 years ago. Even then, even though I can name the tribes, I don't know what their practices are, except for what I research and learn about, right? But those resistance movements, those liberation movements, those create new identities based on the bits and pieces that we can pull together. That's what Chicano is, right? Mm-hmm. Chicano is an identity born of resistance and liberation. Black is an identity born of resistance and liberation. So that's the freeing part. That's the rehumanizing part. Like, yeah, you stole this from us, but now we're going to take what we do have left and create power from that, right? And that's the part that's often left out in study.
Well, nothing for us without us, from the disabilities movement. The queer movement, reclaiming that.
I love watching right now the autistic community reclaim their stories, right? That's been really wonderful to see too.
Well, this is a wonderful conversation. I'm curious here if you have any calls to action for anybody listening to this.
There's so much. I feel like people are just stuck, like frozen, because there's so much. We're under attack from every single angle. And that creates like this overload where people don't know exactly what to do. And so my call to action is first breathe. Like, breathe and take care of yourself, because you're not going to help anybody if you're not taking care of yourself. That's that self-love we're talking about, right? That's one beautiful thing about Washington Ethnic Studies now, is that it's a nonprofit. Yes, so we're part of the nonprofit industrial complex, which is really complicated and problematic. And we've created a nonprofit that's committed to anti-capitalist and anti-racist values. And so, like, I have unlimited PTO. Like, I can take off however much time I want, because people realize that if I'm not taking care of myself, there is no Washington Ethnic Studies now. So breathe, look at what you can impact. Like, if you're trying to change something at a level that you have no access to, you're just going to burn out. So look at what your locus of control, right? What's within your locus of control? Where can you influence? I think we need a lot of people coming to these school board meetings, because there are two groups: the Moms for Liberty, which the Southern Poverty Law Center just called the hate group. And there's another one specific to Washington State called Conservative Ladies of Washington. They're on par with Moms of Liberty, and I'm sure they will be considered a hate group soon. The Conservative Ladies of Washington are running candidates and winning. in Washington State. And so I think, especially in Washington State, we feel like, oh, we live in this blue bubble. It's not happening. No, it is happening here. And it's happening here because people are ignoring and dismissing the amazing organizing work that the right is engaged in right now. They are out organizing us. And so they show up like when we were working with PESB, they showed up to a PESB board meeting, the Conservative Ladies of Washington, and FAIR, the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism, like 20 people testifying against Washington Ethnic Studies now, calling us racist, calling us anti-Semitic, the whole anti-trans thing. Like they were coming out saying that we support trans students and we brainwash people and indoctrinate people in critical race theory. So we need more counter voices in those spaces because they're winning. They're out organizing us and they're winning. If you don't have time to show up to the school boards, donate to organizations that are doing it. So Washington Ethnic Studies now, we accept donations. And then because a lot of our advocacy work is paid for through member donations and through contracts that we have with schools, because we get grants, but the grants are limited and you're not allowed to do political advocacy and things like that. So for our political work, we have to depend on those contracts and on member donations. So yeah, local work is sometimes, no, I'm going to say always more important than the meta stuff, like the state level or national level stuff, right? It's the local elections where these conservative hate groups are winning and we're losing.
I really appreciate this call for self-care first, right? We're going to care for self, be ready, and do the work. I've been wrapping these up with a question around your own educational experience in schooling. Did you go to public ed? Was it K-12? How did that impact you?
Yeah, I went to school in Southern California, mostly in Norwalk, which is a suburb of Los Angeles, predominantly Mexican-American community. I am Chicanekis, mixed race. My mom is white and my dad is Mexican. And like everybody on my block was Mexican-American. Like my mom was probably the only white person. No brown educators whatsoever, 100% white educators. This was like in the 80s, 90s. And then in elementary school, so this is the 80s, I was identified as a gifted student. In California, they call it the GATE program, Gifted and Talented Education. And so they would pick me up from my school along with the other handful of kids that were in the GATE program, and we'd get bused to another school and we'd have this cohort model. And I was the only Chicana student there in this neighborhood that was nearly entirely, like the other kids were white or Asian, right? And then I would go back to my school and see like maybe 2 Asian kids, maybe like half a dozen white kids, right? And the rest of the 300 student body would be brown. And so from a very young age, and I think also being mixed race was part of it. As a mixed race person, you're always thinking about race because you don't fit into either one, right? I've never claimed to be white though, because that's just, I never connected with my white identity, probably because my last name was Castro. In California, I was super brown. I'm only kind of brown in Washington because there's no sun. But in California, I was darker. I had the last name. I lived in the Mexican-American neighborhood, and white never fit me. It was just always apparent to me that something was wrong with my education. And being in the gifted program brought that home. And then in high school, when you start understanding, like, who am I and where do I fit in? Let me go back. In middle school, I remember there were a lot of gangs too in that time period near LA. And so there were Mexican gangs. Where I lived, the Mexican mafia was really active. And I remember getting into fights a lot because I wasn't part of a gang. And my Mexican-American peers calling me a traitor to la raza. Mm. That's what they'd always call me because I wasn't in a gang. And so then eventually I started joining gangs, right? Because that's what I'm supposed to do because that's what I'm Mexican-American. And I remember in high school then having conversations with my peers, a lot of whom were gang members or drug dealers or whatever. What is Mexican-American culture? What is Chicano culture? And because we didn't have any guidance from older people, from elders, it just stands out in my mind like it was yesterday. One guy said, well, prison and gangs, those are our culture. And I was like, well, they're not, but I didn't like, I knew that that wasn't true, but I didn't have an alternative, right? And so that was kind of my call to action, to research and find that alternative, right? And that's when I learned about the Chicano movement and started getting more involved with that and learning about that. We didn't have like a mecha or anything like that at my school. Mostly just learned from my friends. You know, I always wanted to be a teacher. And so after those experiences, I knew this is what I'm going to do. Like, kids shouldn't have to be going and searching for this information on their own. And there should be somebody out there countering the messages we see in media, right? Because the only time I saw people who looked like me or had names like me, they were maids or gangbangers or gardeners or drug dealers, right? And so there needs to be a counter to that. And there wasn't when
a counter to labor or crime.
Mhm.
Those are the two options. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. This has been just a wonderful conversation. I applaud your work, and I'm so grateful that there are folks in Washington State like you who are at the forefront of this effort, and we need you. We need you. So thank you for all your work.
Thank you.
All right.